What's going on, guys? In this video, I'm going to show you how we can create basically an API proxy server or relay server using Node.js. And the main reason I want to do this is to show you how we can hide our public API keys by using our own server. Because in a lot of cases, when you use a third-party API like the GitHub API or Twitter, or in our case, we're going to be using Open Weather Map, a lot of times you need to include your API key directly in the URL when you make your request. So here I have a very simple, just client-side vanilla JavaScript weather app that uses Open Weather, and we can just put in a city and it just gets the temperature. But I want to show you, if I open up my source code here and I look in my main.js, you'll see that in this fetch weather function, I'm making a request directly to Open Weather Map, and I have my API key or my app ID directly in my client-side code, which you really don't want to do. So there's a few ways around this, and one way is to just have your own server, your own API proxy server, which is kind of like a middleman that you can make requests to and then store your API key on the server. So that's what I want to do. And in addition to that, I want to show you how we can add things like rate limiting, so people can only make a certain amount of requests per a certain amount of time. And I'll show you how to add some caching. So we're just going to create our own server. So let's close this up. And right now in VS Code, I just have I have a folder called Node API Proxy Server, and I just have a public folder with the front end files, which you're seeing right here. Right now, I'm just using Live Server to display in the browser. I'm actually going to cut that off because we don't need that. So we have an index.html, some styles, and then the main.js. So this is the front end JavaScript. This is what I just showed you in the browser. And just to quickly go over it so you know what's going on, we have a fetch weather function, and we're requesting directly from the API here, and I have the API key right in the code, which obviously we don't want. That's the purpose of this video. And then down here, I'm just getting the data, I'm formatting it and passing it into this add weather to DOM, which will then display the data here, the city and the temperature. And then down here, I just have my event listener for the form, which will call fetch weather with whatever city I put in the form. And we have an initial fetch with the city of Miami passed in. So that's the front end JavaScript, very simple. Now, if you're following along, which I would definitely suggest you do, you can just create a new folder. You don't have to worry about this public folder right now because we're just going to use Postman to make our requests. And you should also create your own API key from Open Weather Map. And you just log in, create a free account, and then go to My API Keys, and you should see your key here. So make sure you use your own and not mine. So first thing we want to do, let's open up a terminal, and we just want to run npm init-y, which will create a package.json file. And then as far as dependencies, we're going to be using quite a few. Right now I'm just going to install Express. Let's install .env. That'll allow us to have environment variables. That's ultimately where we want to store our API key. We're also going to install cores, and we're going to install Needle, which is an HTTP client, a very lightweight client that we can use on our server. So basically, the front end will make the request to our server. We'll use Needle from our server to make the request to the public API, to Open Weather. All right, so now that we've done that, let's actually, I want to install NodeMon too. So let's do npm install -D because we're installing this as a dev dependency. And that will just allow us to run our server without having to restart it every time we make a change. And then in the package.json, you should see your dependencies. And let's go ahead and add a start script here. So for start, we're just going to say node. We'll say node index. I'm going to call the main entry file index.js. And then let's also do NodeMon, and this one is going to be our dev script. So npm run dev. Okay, now let's create a file. So say touch index.js, and that's going to be our main entry point. So from here, let's start to create our Express server. And we may do a deployment as well, because I know it can be confusing now that we have a back end, now that we have a server. I think Heroku is one of the easiest platforms to deploy something like this. So we might do that at the end if we have time. So let's Let's require Express here, and let's also bring in cores. And then I'm going to set a port here, port number. We're going to set that to process.env.port. So basically it's going to see if we have an environment variable called port first. If we don't, then we'll use 5000. And then let's see, we'll go ahead and set up Express or initialize Express. And I'm just going to put some comments here. We're going to enable cores, so app.use cores, and then let's go ahead and app.listen. We want to listen on that port, and we'll just have a callback here and say console.log. Put a template string in here and say server. We'll say server running on port, and then whatever that port is. So we should be able to run this if we do npm run dev. All right, so now you can see it's watching on port 5000. So let's see, what do I want to do now? Let's take care of just storing our API key. So what we're going to do is we installed .env, right? Yeah, we installed .env. So to use that, we just have to go up here and require it. So we want to say require .env, and we just want to add on to this .config. And now in our root here, in the root of our file structure, we're going to create a file called .env, .env. And the way that I'm going to do this, I'm going to store a couple things here. First is going to be the API base URL. Now I'm creating this in a way that is sort of reusable, so you can use it with other public APIs and not just Open Weather Map. So I'm going to do things a little bit different than if it was just for this API. So let's put, actually I'll just grab this. It's going to be, let's see, it's going to be this right here, right before the Q param here. Actually, we want HTTPS. All right, so that's going to be our base URL. Then I'm going to have our API key name. So what I mean by the name, if you look here, you pass in app ID, that's going to be the name, and then the API key is going to be the value. So the name for this is going to be app ID. And then let's do API key value. That's going to be your actual API key, which for me is this here. Okay, so those are the three environment variables that we're going to have. So we're going to close that up. We'll get to those in a bit. Let's go ahead and create a route here. So, and if you're not familiar with Express, you probably should watch like my Node crash course and then my Express crash course first, because I'm not going to go over what routes are and all that. But I want this to go to /API, and then we have our function here. This takes in request response, and I'm just going to res.json. So I'm going to return with JSON and just put in for now success true. And now I'm going to open up Postman, and you can use any HTTP client. You could use your browser if you want, but there's some headers and stuff that I'm going to want to show you later, so this is more helpful. But let's do HTTP localhost port 5000 /API, and we should see success true. It should be a 200 response, a 200 status. Now I'm not going to want to put everything in the route. I'm not going to want to put in this file, so I'm going to create a folder called routes, and inside routes you could be very specific and put like weather.js, since these routes are to deal with the weather API, but again I want to make this kind of reusable, so I'm just going to call this index.js. And then to use the router we need to bring in Express, so let's require Express, and then let's say const router, set that to express dot, and we want to do capital R router. And then before I forget, let's module.exports, because we want to use this in another file. And then as far as the route, we're only going to need one, so I'm going to just grab this, cut that, put that in here. Whoops, let me just cut that again, and let's put that in here. We just want to change app to router. Okay, and I'm going to change this to just /. Now I want to have /API go to this route automatically. So what we're going to do is include our routes here. And let's do app.use. So we're going to say whenever we go to /API, we want to require the routes/index file. Now, since it's called index, we don't even need to put index. We can just simply do routes. So if I save that, this should still work. If I send, you'll see we still get success true. So we hit this route, and it's going to look in this file at this route right here. All right, so now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and bring in Needle, which is what we're going to use for our request. So let's say Needle, set that to require. And you could use something like node fetch if you want, but I think the latest version of node fetch, you can't use common JS syntax. You have to use ES modules. I had some issues with it. So we brought that in. Now let's see what we want to do next. Yeah, let's get rid of this. And let's make our request. Now that we're going to use async await because Needle does return a promise. So we want to make this function async. And then let's say const API response. Don't call it res because it'll get tricked up because of this. So API res, and that's going to equal Needle, or I'm sorry, await Needle. We're using async await. This returns a promise. And let's say this is going to be get request, and then the URL is what we have in our .env. So what I'm going to do is go up here and let's say environment variables. I'm just going to put them in regular variables. So API base URL is going to be equal to process.env.API base URL. We might as well bring in the other two that we need, which is API key name, API key name, API key value, and process.env. This is just how we get our environment variables. Okay, and when you add environment variables or you change them, you do have to restart the server. So I don't think I did that, so I'm just going to restart that real quick, and then we'll go back to our request here, and the URL that we want, let's put some backticks in here, and we're going to put in our API underscore base URL. Okay, so that will make the request. It'll put the response into this variable, and then what we want is API res.body. That's going to have the actual weather information. So I'm going to have a variable here called data, and let's set that to API res.body. And then that's what we want to respond with. So let's say res, we can do res.json, but I usually like to put the status anyway. So set it to a 200 and then .json and then data. And you know what? I actually meant to put this in a try catch. So let's just add a try catch here, and then we'll take this and put this into the try. And then if something goes wrong, then let's do a res.status 500, which is an internal error, server error. And then let's do JSON and just put in whatever the error is. And we can add a custom error handler later if we have time. So let's just save that and let's see what we get. So we'll go over here. We just want to hit that route again. And what we get is to be expected. We get a 401, which is unauthorized, and we get invalid API key. The reason for that is we didn't include any API key on the, we're just making a request directly to the URL. So we have the API key value here. We also have the name. So we want to attach those as query params. Now we could do that just manually like this. You know, we could have whatever app ID equals blah, 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 or we can use URL search params, which is what I'm going to do. So let's go above here and let's say const, and we'll call this params and set that to new URL search params. And then this takes in an object of params that you want to add. Now what we want to add is our app ID, which is the key name, right? So I want to use this as the key of this object item. So to do that, we need to add brackets, and then we can put our API key name, which is going to be app ID in this case, because that's what we set in the .env. And then that's going to be equal to the value. Okay. Now to add that as a param, we can go over here and just put a question. We want to go outside of the, we want to go inside of the template string here, put a question mark, and then we want to put params. So that should attach the API key to that. So let's go back here and send, and now we don't get the API key message. We get nothing to geocode, and that's because it doesn't know what city we want to add. Because if we look at the format of the request, we have this done, right? But we don't have this Q equals city name. And what I want to do is make it so that whatever query params we pass in to our server, I basically want to forward onto the public URL endpoint. So there's a few ways to do that. What I'm going to do is bring in up here, let's say const URL. So we're going to require the URL module, which is part of Node, so we don't have to install it or anything. And then, let's see, I'm just going to console log, just so you can see what this does. Let's do a console log of url.parse, and we can get the URL with request.url. And then, is it URL? Yeah. And then true. And then I want to do .query, because I want to be able to get whatever query params are passed in. So if I were to go back to Postman, and right now I have nothing passed in as a query param, and I send, we're just going to see an empty object in the console down here. But if I were to add, let's do question mark, and we'll do Q equals Boston. If I send, now you can see we get Q Boston, and it'll add whatever I put here. So if I do like ampersand hello equals world and send, that'll get added to the object. Okay, and then that's why this is going to be kind of reusable, because whatever you pass in is going to get forwarded onto that, onto the public API. So now we're just logging that, but what I want to do is cut that, and I want to add it to my URL params here. But I don't want to just add it like that. I want to spread across the values. So I'm going to add the spread operator in front of it. Okay, so now what should get added onto the URL, to the the API URL, open weather, is the API key with the key name, which is app ID, and also anything I pass in, including the Q equals whatever city. So now let's save that, and let's make this request again with this Q equals Boston, and now we get the weather. Okay, so we're hitting our own server's endpoint, and then it's basically forwarding to the open weather API. We're getting that response back, and we're returning that data back from our server. And in fact, what we could do is, in development mode, we could log down here the actual request that's being made to our public API. So let's just say if, and we'll do process.env, and we want to check to see if we're not in production. So node_env, if that's not equal to production, then let's just do a console log, and we'll put in our template string here, and I'm just going to say request : and let's get the API _ base _ URL, and then we want our params. So it's just going to log whatever is being requested. So let's send, and now down here you can see exactly what is being called. We have the open weather map base URL, and we have our app ID equal to our API key, and we have Q equals to Boston. You don't have to do this, it's just to show exactly what's happening here. So let's just say log the request to the public API. Okay. Now, we are pretty much ready to go. We could just go ahead and use our custom endpoint here in our front end, but I do want to show you a couple other things. So the first is going to be rate limiting. So let's stop the server for a second and just install something called express-rate-limit. I'm also going to install something called API cache. And then we'll go ahead and run the server again. Now for rate limiting, I'm going to put this in the main index.js file. Basically, I want this to be for any and all routes. So let's go up here and let's say const and say rate limit and set that to require express rate limit. And then we just need to add the middleware. Let's see, we'll go right here and let's say rate limiting. And this is in the docs if you want to check that out, but we're going to call this, we'll say limiter, set that to rate limit. And then this takes in an object of options. First is going to be window ms. So this is going to be the time that we want the user to, let's say we want them to do 100 within 10 minutes max. So let's make 10 minutes here. This is going to be milliseconds. So let's do 10 times 60 times 1000. Okay, so that's going to be 10 minutes. And you can set this to whatever you want. And then max is going to be how many times in 10 minutes can they make their requests, or how many requests in that time. So let's make it something low so we can test it out. We'll say 5. Okay, so that puts it in the variable. Now we just need to add the middleware with app.use, pass in limiter. And then we are using this as a proxy, so let's do app.set, and we just want to set trust proxy to 1. Okay, now this should give us limiting now, so let's try it out. So I'm over here, I'm going to make a request that's 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4, 5, and now 6. You'll see that I get too many requests, please try again later. So this will stop people from spamming your endpoint. And you could even see, I'm going to change this to 100, and we could even see in the headers here, let's see, so right here, X rate limit, we have 100 because I set it to 100, and this shows us what we have remaining, so 99 remaining. If I send, that goes down to 98, 97, and so on. And once I get to 0, it's going to basically just kick me off for 10 minutes. Okay, and of course you could set that to whatever you'd like. So now let's go ahead and add some caching. So I'm going to go to my route here, and we're going to use the API cache package that we installed. So let's say API cache, set that to require API cache, and then we want to initialize our cache. So we'll say let cache, we'll set that to API cache.middleware. Whoops. And this is in the docs if you want to check out the API cache docs. And then all we have to do to use middleware, we just add it as a second argument here. So in here we can add cache, just make sure you put a comma here, and then you can put the time you want, let's say 2 minutes. So it's going to cache the response to this route for 2 minutes. Should be minutes. All right, so now if we go over here and we make our requests, we get our data back, but let's take a look at the headers, and you'll notice now we have this cache control. It says max age 120. So at the time of making this, that was our first request, so we have 120 seconds, which is 2 minutes, because that's what we set here. So if I send again, now 104, so it's going to give us the cached response for this amount of time, 104 seconds, 97, so it just keeps counting down. Once it gets to 0, it'll give us, it'll make the actual request, and it'll store that for 2 more minutes. And you could put this to whatever you want. And it really depends on the API on how long you want this. If it's something that's constantly updating, you're not gonna want this to be too long. All right, now I think we're all set to actually use this with our client-side application, which we have in the public folder. So with Express, we can make a certain folder, our static folder, which I'm going to set the public one to. So let's go, we'll go right above the routes here, and let's say set static folder. And to do that, we can just do app.use, and in here we want to say, we want to do express.set static, and we're going to make the folder named public our static folder. So we should be able to go to localhost 5000 and it should load our index.html. So let's open up a browser and let's go to HTTP localhost 5000. Okay, and if we open up our console down here, now we're still trying to make the request to the public API. If we look in our public main.js, so right here, and we don't want to do that. We now want to make the request to our own API. Now there's different ways you can do this. We happen to have this like, we have our public folder, we have our front end on the same server. You might want to just deploy your API somewhere else with a specific domain, and then you would add that, you could connect to that domain here. But in our case, we're just going to simply do /API/ not slash, we want to add the Q param here, or Q string, to whatever the city is that's passed into this function. So like that. All right, so let's save that now and let's reload. And now we should be able to get our weather. But if we look at our source code, unlike before, if we look at our main.js and we look at our fetch weather, there's no API key here. Okay, we're interacting with our own server, and the API key is stored on the server side. It's not on the client, so someone can't come along and steal our API key. All right, and you can do this for working with any public API. It's not just open weather. And I tried to make this so it's kind of a boilerplate that you could use with other projects as well. So I think the next thing we'll do is actually deploy this. So to get ready for deployment, let's go ahead and create a .gitignore. And we're going to use Heroku. Whoops, git, not got. We're going to use Heroku to deploy, and we're going to use git to do that. So we don't want to add the .env file, right? Because that has our API keys in it. We want to keep that out of our repository. We also don't want node modules. So we're going to add those. And then I'm just going to create a .env.example just for my GitHub repo on GitHub, so that people know what they need to put in here. So I'm going to copy this, put that in there, and then just keep these blank. All right, so we can close all this up. Next thing we want to do is let's go to Heroku. And if you don't have an account, just go ahead and create one. We'll do that later. All right, so all your projects will show here. If you don't have any, obviously you won't see any. And you want to install the Heroku CLI, which I already have installed, but you can see right here, if you're on Mac, you can use Homebrew. Windows, you can install it. Ubuntu, you can use your package manager. So I already have it installed, so I'm going to just go ahead and close this up. And we want to just do Heroku login. Press any key, it's going to open up in the browser, and we'll just click login. Okay, so now I'm logged in with my Heroku account. Next thing I want to do is create a Heroku application. So let's say Heroku create, and we can name it. I'm going to call this, I'll just call it Node. Oh, let's call it something to do with open weather. We'll just say, I don't know, call it Traversy Weather App. So it's going to create that application. And if I go back to my dashboard here and reload, I should see it. Okay, there's not going to be anything there. If I click on it and I go to Open App, it's just going to be a welcome page. We haven't pushed anything to it yet. So what we want to do next is go to Deploy, and we want to add this Git repo. So we're going to copy this right here. Yours will be called something different. And then let's first initialize a Git repository, Git init. We haven't done that yet. And then let's go ahead and git add everything. Let's git commit. We'll say git commit am initial Okay, and then I'm going to paste that in. I'm just adding the Heroku repo. And then we should be able to git push Heroku master. Okay, so now this should push everything to Heroku. Okay, so that should be all set. Now let's go back over here and let's check out the app. Now it's not going to work right now because our environment variables, remember, we store on our development side, we stored those in our .env, which we didn't push. We put those in the git ignore. So the way that we can add environment variables in Heroku onto the server is by going to settings and go down here. We can say reveal config vars, and we just want to add those 3 to this. So we can just grab that. So this is going to be API base URL, right? API base URL, and let's paste that in. All right, so we get that, and then API key name is going to be app ID. And then let's grab the actual value, paste that in. This is going to be API underscore key underscore value. Okay, so we're going to add these to our server as environment variables. And our API key is stored here, so it's on the server. It's not accessible to the client. And then let's go ahead and, whoops, that's localhost. Let's get rid of that. And it might take a couple minutes after you enter those environment variables, but now as you can see, this is working. We see our weather in Miami. This is our live application. Let's try a different city. If I put something that isn't a city, we get city not found. Let's do New York. And again, if I were to look at my main.js here, when we look at the request, there's no API key or anything like that. We're just requesting it from our own server where we have the API key stored. All right, so that's how you can hide keys, and you could add things like rate limiting and caching, and there's other things you could do as well. So that's it. I hope you guys learned something from this, and I will see you next time.